Hello and welcome to episode number 22 of the Joe Cannon Health Podcast. I'm exercise physiologist Joe Cannon, and if this is your very first time joining me, welcome. Each Friday I try to bring clarity and hopefully common sense to the world of health, fitness, wellness, and nutrition, where my motto is no hype, no spin, just the facts in plain English. This week, I want to talk about a mystery. It's something that I'm betting many of you probably never heard of before, but it's a mystery nonetheless, and one that I have been investigating for a good part of my life. It is the possibility that your earlobes may predict your risk of heart disease. But before we get into any of that, I want to thank Daniel QB15 for his 5-star review in Apple Podcasts, where he writes to us from Mexico, and he says, "There's no one better than Joe Cannon on the subject of Rhabdo. I've been searching for someone who knows about Rhabdo in my country, and by far, he's the best knowing on this subject." For those who are listening for the first time, what Daniel's referring to is rhabdomyolysis. It's a serious but yet rare medical phenomenon where the muscle fibers break down from too much exercise. It's something I wrote a whole book about, and I've discussed it previously on episodes 7 and 13. So skip back there to episodes 7 and 13 if you want to know more about Rhabdo. Daniel, from your words, it sounds like you've either dealt with Rhabdo yourself or you know it's somebody who has Rhabdo. In case you missed it, I also write a lot about rhabdomyolysis on my website, joe-cannon.com, joe-cannon.com. Just go there and look for the Rhabdo category. It's on the right side of my website. Either way, speedy recovery, and know that I will be discussing Rhabdo many times in the future on this podcast. So stay tuned. Every week, I like to delve into a myth because the world of health and fitness and wellness has got more myths and misunderstandings than you can shake a stick at. So each episode, I like to cover a different myth. And this week is going to be about the liver. Specifically, does your liver need to be detoxed or cleansed? I am the very first to recognize that the liver does not get the attention it deserves. It is an extremely important organ that we cannot live without. The liver removes cholesterol from the body. It does also detoxify the body. It helps us get rid of drugs and other compounds, which if they built up could be very unhealthy for us. In addition to that, the liver is crucial to our metabolism of proteins and fats and carbohydrates. And speaking of carbohydrates, the liver is also a storage reservoir of carbohydrates itself. It's called glycogen. Glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates in the body, and we store glycogen in our muscles and also in our liver. So really, really important organ. And given all the critical work that it does on a daily basis, I know there are some out there who have advocated that the liver sometimes needs to periodically cleanse itself or be detoxified, take a rest, if you will, so it can function at its full capacity once again. Now, as you can imagine, there's no shortage of vitamins and herbs and other dietary supplements that are touted to improve liver function. But let's cut to the chase. Does the liver really need to be detoxified through dietary supplements in order to function optimally? I can tell you that I cannot locate any good proof of this. If you are basically a basic healthy person, you don't need to cleanse your liver with herbs or vitamins or even enemas or colonics. Yeah, they're out there as well. I have actually looked for proof. I can find no convincing evidence on this topic. And when you think about it, this kind of makes sense. If we really needed to periodically detoxify our livers, none of us would be here. The human race would have gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. We are a very resilient species. That's why we've been around so long. So I know to counter my argument here is there are some who would say, but Joe, our food supply is not as good as it was thousands of years ago. Well, to counter that argument, I'd say in some ways it is better, but I'll agree there are some disadvantages to what we eat today. For example, we tend to eat too many things that come in cans, boxes, or have wrappers around them. Now, while that's true, that doesn't necessarily mean the answers to our problems lies in taking overpriced dietary supplements. Oh, by the way, who some of these experts who tout how great they are also tend to be selling these things. But if you're thinking about your liver health, I think that's great because, again, I think the liver needs to get more attention. So if you want to be friendly to your liver and help your liver function as optimal capacity, I do have a protocol for you. I got a 3-step liver detoxification, liver health protocol, whatever you want to call it, no supplements required. Here are my 3 steps. Number 1, eat a better diet. And by better diet, I mean less saturated fats, less trans fats, more colorful foods, green, purple, orange, red, whatever. More colorful foods, less saturated fats, less trans fats. All right? That's number 1. Number 2, if you have to lose weight, try to lose weight. You don't have to lose a lot either. Even as little as 7 to 10% of body weight has been shown to improve liver functioning. So again, it doesn't take a lot. And then the third part of my liver detox protocol would be to exercise a little bit on a regular basis. I'm not talking about running a marathon or doing CrossFit classes or anything like that. If you could simply do a 20 to 30 minute walk a few times a week, that's going to help your liver function better. So it doesn't take a lot of physical activity to help your liver. Just a little bit is all it takes. Studies have shown that these 3 things can prevent and reduce and even reverse the buildup of fat inside the liver. You don't want to have a lot of fat in your liver because if you did, you would eventually develop a condition called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. As the name implies, this is a medical condition where fat accumulates in the liver. This reduces the functioning of the liver. And also, as the name implies, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is a medical condition that's not caused by alcoholism. So, sidebar, yeah, alcoholism can lead to fatty liver disease as well. So technically, I could add a 4th step to my 3-step protocol and just say limit alcohol consumption as well. So why did I take a little detour and talk about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Well, odds are many people have probably never heard of this disease before. And that's one reason, but the other reason is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease increases the risk of cirrhosis of the liver. Cirrhosis of the liver is where the liver becomes scarred. And as the scarring gets worse, the liver stops working. And so non-alcoholic fatty liver disease can literally lead ultimately to liver failure. And non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is projected to become, unfortunately, the number 1 cause of liver transplants in the coming decades. So, myth busted. Yes, the liver is very important. And yes, liver disease is a real thing. But if you are essentially a healthy person, you don't need to detox your liver periodically with various dietary supplements, herbal products, enemas, you name it. You can naturally detoxify and cleanse your liver by moving more, eating better. That's essentially it. Oh, and while we're on the topic of liver health, if you jump back to episode number 20, that's where I devoted an entire episode to, ironically, dietary supplements that can cause liver failure. You probably want to take a look at episode number 20 because I covered some dietary supplements that I think people are using, and you may be surprised by what I discussed. Okay, so let's leave the myth alone for a little bit, at least till next week, and let's talk about the meat of the podcast. What if there was a way for you to physically see heart disease on your body right now? Would that frighten you, or would that empower you? This week, I want to tell you about the association between your earlobes and heart disease. What I'm talking about here is something called the diagonal earlobe crease, or sometimes it's simply called the earlobe crease. It is a line or crease or wrinkle, if you will, in the skin of the earlobe. It's diagonal. It usually goes at about a 45-degree angle, not usually right across the earlobe, not up and down, but diagonally across the earlobes. You can literally see it on some of the earlobes of individuals. And the crease can vary in how deep it goes. It can be a little bit of a line in some individuals. There could be several little lines, or sometimes the crease may be so deep that it penetrates the skin so deep that the earlobe itself will point outwards away from the body. I've actually seen that in individuals. The crease usually begins on one earlobe, either the left or the right, and over time it can progress to both earlobes. When it's in both earlobes, it's said to be bilateral earlobe creases. Now, oddly, more men tend to have earlobe creases than women. And equally interesting, us white guys tend to have the most earlobe creases, while Asians tend to have the least. Take that for what it's worth. Now, if you're hearing about this for the first time, I want you to realize that this has been around a while. It was first observed in the early 1970s by Dr. Frank Sanders. And when you discover something, they name it after you. So if you're doing your own investigations on this topic, you're also going to see it called by its other name, Frank's sign. Frank's sign is a reference to Dr. Frank Sanders, who discovered it. And I don't want you to get the impression that this is some kind of a phenomenon of living in the industrial age, because this apparently has been with us for a long time. The earlobe crease has even been observed in the statues of ancient Roman rulers. Again, these statues go back thousands of years. And when archaeologists find these statues and they take a close look, what do they see? In the earlobes, they see a diagonal earlobe crease. So really interesting stuff. Now, if you're hearing about this for the first time, I know it sounds crazy. And so what I want to do in the next few moments in our time together this week is basically rattle off the findings from a lot of different studies that have been conducted over the last few decades on the earlobe crease to help you better understand what's going on. One of the very first investigations, this one goes way back to the 1970s, researchers looked at 50 people and they observed that of all the heart disease risk factors they were looking for, the one that was associated the most with heart disease was, you guessed it, the diagonal earlobe crease. A few years after that, in early 1980s, doctors looked at 1,000 people. They also noticed a strong correlation between heart disease and the presence of a diagonal earlobe crease. Researchers also in the 1980s looked at 350 different people and found that 65% of those with heart disease had that diagonal earlobe crease compared to only 23% who did not have the diagonal earlobe crease. So again, the more likely you saw the crease in the earlobes, the more likely that person was to have heart disease. Other physicians looking at over 200 people in a separate investigation noted that those individuals tended to have higher cholesterol levels, and the earlobe crease, again, was, no surprise, a better predictor of heart disease than other risk factors they were looking at. And that's not all I got for you. In an even bigger study, this one involving about 1,400 people, researchers observed that the earlobe crease was present in, again, 65% of those with heart disease symptoms, but only in 28% in those who didn't. Again, a much stronger association between a heart disease and the earlobe crease than in those who did not have the earlobe crease. If we jump forward into the 21st century, we find a study from 2006 where investigators basically looked at the autopsies of over 500 people, and they concluded that the presence of the earlobe crease was, again, strongly correlated with the development of heart disease in both men and women. So again, earlier I'd said that men tend to get more of these creases than women, but it doesn't mean that women are free from this. There are some women out there who may also have creases in their earlobes. Interestingly, in this other investigation, another reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is if you're under the age of 40 and you have the crease, you may want to go and run this past your doctor, because these researchers concluded that this earlobe crease could be especially useful in screening for premature heart disease in younger individuals. And the reason they said this is that the earlobe crease predicted heart disease in people younger than 40 80% of the time. So even in younger people, the presence of this crease in the earlobes seemed to be indicative of developing or even having certain degrees of heart disease. So a more interesting study, and that one was pretty interesting, but another one other researchers looked at 65 guys who had earlobe creases or who did not have earlobe creases, and they observed that those who had creases in their earlobes also had thickening of the carotid arteries of the body. Again, heart disease is a blood vessel damaged disease. The blood vessels are thicker and tighter, and they're hardening of the arteries, if you will. And again, these researchers noted that earlobe creases, thicker, more stiffened blood vessels, if you will, seem to be associated with each other. And this is not the only study to find this. Again, if it was one study, it would be interesting, but it was another investigation a couple years later. These researchers actually looked at over 200 people in Japan, again, finding a significant association between the earlobe crease and thickening of the carotid arteries. And no surprise, they also noted that guys got more of these earlobe creases. Older people tend to have more of these earlobe creases. And additionally, those who had high blood pressure also had more earlobe creases. Sidebar, if you are somebody you know has high blood pressure, skip back to episode number 5. That's where I covered several natural ways that may help some people lower their blood pressure. Now, getting back on target, in 2009, researchers looked at almost 600 basically healthy people between the ages of 20 and 80 years of age. They, again, observed earlobe creases were significantly associated with greater stiffening of the blood vessels. Stiffer blood vessels increases blood pressure, and that in turn could lead to greater risk of heart attacks and strokes. Now, an equally interesting investigation occurred in 2009 where researchers looked at 34 diabetic men under the age of 70 who had bilateral earlobe creases or who did not have bilateral earlobe creases. Again, that would be creases in both of their earlobes. They observed that in guys who had creases in both of their earlobes, they also tended to have shorter telomeres than those who didn't. Take a step back. What are telomeres? Telomeres are extra bits of DNA that are found at the ends of our chromosomes, and they're thought to help protect our DNA from damage. The easy analogy that everybody goes to, because it makes so much sense, is think of the telomeres as like those plastic caps on the ends of your shoelaces. You know, when those plastic caps come undone, the shoelaces get all frayed and they come apart. That's what the same thing these telomeres are supposed to be doing. They're supposed to help protect our DNA becoming frayed and untangled. So basically, as the telomeres shorten, this in some circles is taken to be a sign of the aging process and greater susceptibility to disease. So these researchers noted that these diagonal earlobe creases, having creases in both of those earlobes, appear to be associated with having shorter telomeres. Again, doesn't prove anything, just proves they're associated with each other, but again, it's another piece in the puzzle. Researchers in China, looking at 500 people, again, noticed that diagonal earlobe crease was found in about 75% of people with heart disease, compared to only 46% of those who did not have heart disease. Again, I like this study because it does point out that the presence or absence of the earlobe crease may not be 100% perfect. Again, in this investigation, almost 50% of people who had heart disease did not have earlobe creases, but 75% of them did. Also, those same individuals with the crease, they also had more blocked blood vessels. Again, there seems to be maybe a relationship between blocked, more stiffer blood vessels and the presence of this earlobe crease. Now, one of the signs of heart disease that sometimes you can see on people is called peripheral artery disease. Peripheral artery disease is basically blood vessel damage in the arms and the legs. People who have this peripheral artery disease sometimes find it very difficult to walk for more than a few minutes. They often have to sit down because their legs are hurting. Again, they're hurting from the blocked blood supply because their arteries in their legs are blocked with plaque. So researchers in a separate investigation looked at over 250 people and again noted that the earlobe crease was associated with peripheral artery disease. And not only associated with peripheral artery disease, but it was also associated with a worsening of the disease even before people were showing any symptoms. And that's, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to share this information with you, because is it possible that if you see the earlobe crease, that this may be a warning sign to maybe make a course direction before things get out of control? According to this study, perhaps it might be. In a larger investigation, researchers looked at 1,000 people and again found that more earlobe creases, more heart attacks and strokes. Ironically, however, in this investigation, they did not find an association between the depth of the earlobe crease and the degree of heart attacks and strokes. On the surface, you would imagine that the deeper the crease was, the worse the heart disease might be. These researchers basically said, nah, we didn't see any association. Just the presence of the earlobe crease, irregardless of how deep it was, seemed to be associated with heart attacks and more strokes. Now, we know that a lot of diseases, including heart disease, can be associated with greater levels of inflammation and even oxidative and free radical damage. And I bring that up because there is at least one investigation that has noted that those people with earlobe creases tend to have more oxidative stress in their body and more cellular inflammation than those who do not have that earlobe crease. So these are just some of the research papers that are out there. They're coming out all the time. I didn't list them all, but there's a bunch of them that have been published over the last several decades. Having said that, I would not be giving you the full story if I didn't tell you that there are studies out there that find just the opposite. These investigations essentially say earlobe crease, nah, nothing to do with heart disease whatsoever. So they are out there. And before I recorded this episode, I did look to find those studies, and I just basically wanted to count them up. And I was able to find 6 different clinical studies which said there was no association between the diagonal earlobe crease and heart disease. There may be others out there. I just did a quickie little look. And I can only find 6 studies. That said, as someone who has been paying attention to this topic for many, many years, I can tell you that most of the studies that do come out on this topic do appear to show that there's something going on between the crease in the earlobes and the risk of heart disease or the degree of heart disease. But again, not all studies show this, but a lot of them do. So if there is something going on here, what the heck is the mechanism behind all this? How in the world are creases in the earlobes being related to perhaps heart disease and heart attacks and strokes? I can't tell you. There is no firm scientific mechanism behind how a crease in the earlobe is related to heart disease. So I can't tell you. I can tell you that looking at all the papers over the years, there's basically 3 theories that are postulated behind the crease. And I'll just give them to you here in case you're doing your own research. Number 1, the earlobe crease may reflect blockages in the blood vessels elsewhere in the body. The more blocked blood vessels you have, especially in the heart, the greater the risk of, say, getting heart disease. And that's what a lot of researchers tend to be thinking, I guess, when they publish their research. You see more heart disease, you see more earlobe creases. Another theory is that the earlobe crease is simply a sign of premature aging. Some research has in fact noted greater breakdown of collagen and elastin proteins in the earlobes of those with the earlobe crease compared to those who did not have the earlobe crease. Collagen and elastin are very important proteins that you need for skin. And as they break down, this may cause a breakdown, if you will, of the structural integrity of the skin. So could the earlobe crease just be a basic sign of overall skin aging? Maybe. And it is interesting that children hardly ever are observed to have diagonal earlobe creases. And interestingly, I can tell you as an aside, my grandmother, who lived to 104 and a half years old, didn't have any creases in her earlobes either. And I bring it up because, I would look at Granny's earlobes from time to time over the decades, and I've, never saw any creases. Could that be maybe reflected in her greater level of DNA repair mechanisms? Again, just an interesting observation on my part. I wanted to throw it out to you. And then the third theory out there is, again, the earlobe crease has no relationship to heart disease. Essentially, what this theory says is that the earlobe crease is simply a fact that we're sleeping on our sides so long. Again, over the decades, we're sleeping on one side or another, and you're creasing the skin together as your head is on the pillow, and this could cause wrinkles in the skin and wrinkles in the earlobe. Again, what they're saying here is the earlobe crease is simply a wrinkle. But at the end of the day, I can't tell you which of these theories is the correct one. We all may gravitate to one theory more than the other, but at the end of the day, I think it's anybody's guess right now. Having said that, and having recounted some of the clinical studies on the earlobe crease, what do doctors believe about all this stuff? I can tell you that I have spoken to several doctors over the years, and I can say that my observations, it's kind of mixed in the medical community. I've talked to some physicians who do, in fact, tell me they look at the earlobes of their patients. They may never bring it up in conversations, but they do, in fact, look at earlobes. Conversely, I've talked to other physicians who tell me they don't believe anything about this earlobe crease stuff. They don't pay any attention to it whatsoever. Interestingly, that's also some cardiologists that have told me that as well. So I find it interesting that some doctors may not think that the crease could be related to heart disease, because many doctors accept that ED, erectile dysfunction, can be a sign of heart disease. The idea being blockages of the small blood vessels downstairs may be reflective of blockages elsewhere in the body. Could it be that blockages in the blood vessels of our earlobes may likewise be indicative of blockages elsewhere in the body as well? I can't say either way. Interesting, I've not seen any data that has looked at blood vessel blockages in earlobes. So that would be a study that I would be very interested to see. As I alluded to at the beginning of this episode, I have been investigating this earlobe crease for a good part of my life. I first heard about this when I was about 13 years old, watching an old TV show. It was actually the Merv Griffin show. I remember it like it was yesterday. Merv Griffin, if you're not familiar, was kind of the Oprah of his day. It was a talk show. It came on Monday through Friday at 4 p.m. on ABC. After hearing about all this stuff, I did what a lot of you are probably going to do later today. I ran into the bathroom to look at my earlobes and was thankful that I didn't see anything. And that day began my experiment, if you will. Over the next 40 years, I have periodically been checking my earlobes, and I can tell you, in my 20s, all clear, nothing. My 30s, nothing. 40, nothing. On or around when I was 45 years old, however, I began to see a little line in one of my earlobes. Today, I'm in my 50s. And while from all the blood tests I have and all their medical tests, my risk factor for heart disease is very low, I can tell you that unfortunately I now have small little creases in both of my earlobes. What the heck does this mean? Honestly, I don't know. To the doctors listening to me right now, I know I'm just one guy. I know that an N of 1 study doesn't matter much. At best, I'm a case report. At worst, I'm a guy who fell down the earlobe crease rabbit hole a long time ago. Do my creases mean I have heart disease? Well, I'm pretty sure I have some degree of heart disease, just as I'm sure you probably do too. That's because we know that blood vessel damage begins when we're really young, even in the teenage years. The question here is whether the creases in earlobes can be a visible sign of heart disease. And to that question, all I can say is I'm not really sure at this point. While most of the studies do appear to show that there's an association between the earlobe crease and heart disease, it's also true that people with perfectly smooth-looking earlobes also get heart attacks. So what about you? I know this is some pretty intense stuff, so if you're hearing it for the first time and you just ran in and looked into the bathroom mirror and saw creases in your earlobes, instead of freaking out, why not use this as an opportunity to bring this up to your doctor? Say something like, "Hey doc, I heard something weird today about the earlobes and the risk of heart disease, and I want to get a better idea about it. What do you suggest?" I got to think if you say something like that, I'm pretty sure most doctors are going to probably want to have an honest conversation about this with you. And who knows, they may even decide to run some medical tests on you as well. At the very least, something like this may assuage some of your fears, because I got a thing talking about this has probably given some of you people some things to think about. Even if the earlobe crease ultimately is proven to be a fluke and there's nothing to it, the important thing is that by going to your doctor, you will have more information about your risk of heart disease. And if the answers you get are less than stellar, you can use that knowledge to take action to improve your health. And that is the big takeaway from all this and why I wanted to talk about it. So what do you think? Email me and let me know what you see when you looked in the mirror tonight. As always, the citations for this can be found in the episode notes posted at joe-kennan.com if you want to do your own investigations. And that brings this episode to a close, except for the quote of the week, which comes to us from Gene Roddenberry, creator of my favorite TV show, Star Trek, who said, "Science knows still practically nothing about the real nature of matter, energy, dimension, or time, and even less about those remarkable things called life and thought. But whatever the meaning and purpose of this universe is, you are a legitimate part of it." Until next week, same bat time, same bat channel. Go out, be safe, and where you can, try to make a difference.